Right, this is the next lesson in the Paper 3 Germany unit, in which this is following the Treaty of Versailles lesson that we've done. And today we're going to be looking at the challenges that the Weimar Republic faced in the years 1919 to 1923. Now, the Weimar, the new government, remember, after the failure of the First World War, faced many challenges in the years 1919 to 1923. And we're actually particularly going to look at two today, the Spartacist uprising and the Kapp Putsch. And what these were attempts to overthrow the government and replace them with another group. You also had another uprising that we look at separately in 1923, known as the Munich Putsch. The reason we look at it separately is because the Munich Putsch was Hitler's first attempt to overthrow the government. This wasn't the only problem that the government faced in this period, but we're going to look at other problems they faced next lesson. So today, we need to look at the idea of left-wing, middle, and right-wing politics. We need to have an understanding of that because that's something we're going to talk about a lot in this unit. We're going to look at the events of the Spartacist uprising and Kapp Putsch, and then look at how much of a threat they really were to the strength of the Weimar. So the first starter, the one thing you need to understand with this course is one of the questions is looking at interpretations. Now, an interpretation is a historian's point of view. So your first starter is both of these interpretations talk about the challenges the Weimar government faced. What is the difference? Okay. Interpretation 1 says the government were hated from day one, and due to them being a democratic government, people wanted to overthrow them. Extreme parties from both the left and the right attempted to overthrow the government, which showed that democracy was going to face a huge challenge. Interpretation 2. By 1923, Germany were in an awful position financially, and it led to the missing payments they had to pay the Allies. The German government did not know what to do, and it led to them printing money, which made money worthless. This turned the people against the government, showing their weaknesses. Now, the magic with this question at GCSE is you don't need to have any knowledge. You just need to tell me the difference between the two interpretations. And in this case, interpretation 1 is saying that the government's biggest challenge was people who wanted to overthrow them, that the government were not accepted and people hated a democratic government. Interpretation 2 is saying that the German government, the Weimar government, faced significant financial problems, which led to them having to print money, which caused the economy maybe to collapse. And that's something we look at in the future lesson. You will need to add knowledge to these, but in other questions. But this what's the difference question, you just tell me what it says, back it up with a quote, and then tell me what the other one says, and back it up with a quote. As long as you can identify the main difference between the two interpretations, then you will be on a winner there. So this is a brief timeline about the challenges that the Weimar faced. So these were revolts and attempted overthrows. So in 1919, they had the Spartacist uprising. In 1920, they had the Kapp Putsch. In 1921, they had to 22, they had political assassination, so members of the government who were murdered. So in 1921, Erzberger was killed, and he was someone who signed the Treaty of Versailles. And then in 1922, a politician known as Walter Rathenau. And then in 1923, another overthrow that was attempted was the Munich Putsch, where Hitler attempted overthrowing the Weimar government. So as long as you have an understanding of the attempted overthrows in this period, then you've got a basis for this mini little topic. So why were people in Germany unhappy? So the first thing you need to do is copy this paragraph and fill in the gaps. So a lot of the changes that Germany occurred after their blank in the First World War, many people in Germany felt that democracy had been blank on them. The politicians were especially blamed for blanking the people in the blank after signing the Treaty of Blank. The threat from communism was high due to the fact that blank went through a communist revolution in October 1917. It was agreed that the blank would support Ebert against revolution and that Ebert would blank the army. For some people, the fact the government depended on the army made them look blank. And overall, between the years 1919 to 1923, there were around blank left-wing uprisings and 3 right-wing uprisings, with many more attempts to break away from Germany in places such as Speyer, Plauen, and Wiesbaden. And the key words are stabbing, Versailles, support, army, weak, defeat, forced back Russia, and 5. Spend 5 minutes doing this, and then on the next slide, I will go through the answers. So this is why people were unhappy in Germany. So a lot of the changes occurred after defeat in the First World War. Many people in Germany felt that democracy was forced on them. Remember, after the First World War, Kaiser Wilhelm II left Germany. This was one of the terms that the Allies put in place to end the First World War. They wouldn't have ended the First World War unless Kaiser Wilhelm left. As a result of this, the new democratic Weimar Republic was put in place, and Friedrich Ebert was the first leader. The politicians were especially blamed for stabbing the people in the back after signing the Treaty of Versailles. So the Treaty of Versailles, if you remember, Lamm, caused a lot of anger in Germany as it weakened them quite significantly. They lost, had to pay 6.6 billion reparations. They lost their army, had to go down to 100,000 men. They lost key areas of Germany, such as the Saarland. They had to demilitarize the Rhineland. They had to give back land that they earned in war, such as Alsace-Lorraine. The key thing that was a bit unfair on this government was the fact that they were getting the blame, even though they were the ones who hadn't gone through with the war. The threat from communism was high due to the fact that Russia went through a communist revolution. So there was a big influx of left-wing ideas, communism. And we're going to look at the difference between left-wing, right-wing, and middle politics in a minute. And that'll make more sense. But as Germany, by the end of 1929, communism and extreme parties from the right were becoming very popular. You just need to have an understanding of their ideas. It was agreed that the army would support Ebert against revolution and that Ebert would back the army. So if Ebert had someone that was going against him, he could use the army to destroy it. The problem there is, what if the army agrees with the people that are overthrowing them? You'll remember that, or you'll have to go back to that in a bit. For some people, the fact the government depended on the army made them look weak. And overall, between the years 1919 to 23, there were 5 left-wing uprisings and 3 right-wing uprisings, with many more places in Germany looking to break away from the government, such as Speyer, Plauen, and Wiesbaden. So lots of people were unhappy. Lots of attempts to overthrow the government. But before we get into those, we need to understand, how does politics actually work? This isn't a GCSE in politics, so we're going to do it as basic as possible. So political ideology, you have the left wing, the centre, and the right wing. Now, the left wing and the right wing, if you are based around here, you are known as extreme parties, because you're at the very extreme end of left wing and right wing. Okay? If you're based very much in the centre, the chance is you'll have a very democratic way of thinking. The belief of freedom, fair elections, parliament, and laws. Okay, run by a prime minister, or in Germany's case, a chancellor. Okay. Now, the left wing and the right wing have very extreme ideas. Now, people can be sort of moderately right wing and moderately left wing. Okay, it all really depends. And we do have examples of left wing, centre, and right wing in our country. So the left wing believe that the workers should control the country. They believe in equality, so they don't believe that there should be any rich people within their society. They believe that everything should be shared equally. Doesn't like big business. So left-wing people don't like big businesses holding all the wealth. Okay, and communism this is known as communism. An extreme left-wing idea is known as this. And the only real area this has been enforced successfully, we talk about Russia, and we talk about Stalin's Russia. Communism is something that a lot of people in Germany didn't want, especially big businesses, because big businesses were scared that communism was going to make them share their profits with the workers. So left wing was all about equality, workers in control, and the phrase I like to use is that sharing's caring. The right wing is very different. Okay, the right wing can be very racist, violent, believe in the idea of a dictator. They like control. They like big businesses. And a group that we know in terms of right wing are the Nazis. Okay, the NSDAP, which we'll look at later. The centre are made up of people who believe in democracy, fair elections, belief in parliament. Now, the centre is usually, the people who believe in the concept of centre is usually run by a prime minister with a parliament, and laws are passed through debate and everything along those lines. Now, in Germany, you had a few parties, which we will talk about a bit more later on, but I'm going to add them here. On the left wing, you had the KPD, who were the Communist Party. They were the most successful and famous Communist Party. In the middle, you had the Social Democrats. Now, these made up most of the Weimar Republic. And the right wing, the most famous was the NSDAP, which was the Nazi party. But you also had right-wing groups like the DAP. Okay? Now, you don't need to have a clear understanding of, the intricacies of politics. You just need to have an understanding of what left wing stands for, what the centre stands for, and what the right wing stands for. So what we're going to do is I'm going to put a list of statements, and you need to decide whether they stand for left-wing ideology, right-wing ideology, or centre. So, just go through a few together. Believes in survival of the fittest, and that the weak do not belong in society. This is right-wing, okay? Because it's very. Trying to think of the correct phrase to use this. It's very limited about who's accepted in society. Okay. Very moderate and tries to keep everyone happy. That's going to be the centre. Believes that workers should be in control, not the government. That's the left wing. Okay. Hated the Weimar Republic. Well, that's going to be right and left. Rich and the middle class would fear this idea. Now remember, that's going to be left wing, because the rich and the middle class would not want to share their money. And the left wing would make sure that there's more equality in regards to the working class. Believe the idea that workers should control the country. That's left wing. Wanted a dictator. That's right wing. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Hopefully you understand that, right? Go through these and add left, centre, or right. And then we can move on and look at the threats that the government faced. So these are the challenges faced by the Weimar in 1919 to 23, and we're going to look at two today. The Spartacist uprising. Now, the Spartacist uprising was a left-wing overthrow, attempted overthrow. I can add that there on this table, left. The Kapp Putsch was a right-wing attempted overthrow. And you're going to look at today why they were unhappy, what actually happened, and what the consequences were. Now remember, just going back to the right wing, the chances right wing would be supported by the army. The left wing wouldn't. But remember, the army agreed to help the government during overthrows. I can tell you this now, the army did not help during the Kapp Putsch, but they did help during the Spartacist uprising. So I'm going to go through some information for each one, and then I need you to fill in this table as we go. So first one we're going to look at is the Spartacist uprising. Now, in 1919, a new democratic government came to power. You know this, okay? The first president was Frederick Ebert. This upset a lot of people on the left and the right because they thought they should be in control. Now, to get in control, they'd have to overthrow the government and take power. The left believed in worker control. The right wanted a return to the rule of the Kaiser, a dictatorship. The place the opposition focused on was Berlin, because it was the capital of Germany. So To become successful, you had to get control of Berlin first. The first attempt at power was in January 1919 by the Communist Party. Now, I'm just going to add something in here. By January 1919, the Treaty of Versailles had not been signed yet. Just remember that. So in 1919, the Spartacist League, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, they were the leaders of this overthrow. Their aim was to overthrow the government and replace it with a communist government, with the workers in clear control. On the 5th of January, the Spartacists marched on Berlin and captured the headquarters of the government's newspaper and the Telegraph Bureau. That's all they got. Now, if you're trying to overthrow an area, I think you're going to need to get more than the headquarters of the government's newspaper and the Telegraph Bureau. They didn't capture anywhere else. By the 15th of January, 10 days after it started, the uprising was dead, and both leaders were brutally murdered, with Rosa Luxemburg's body being thrown into a canal. How? How did this uprising get crushed so easily in 10 days? The uprising was crushed because the government used a group of military soldiers known as the Freikorps. Okay, now this group's really important to remember. The Freikorps were a group of soldiers made up of men who had fought in World War I, who technically should hate the Weimar Republic, but they still helped them. The reason for this is because the army, military personnel agreed to help the Weimar Republic. Not just this, but these individuals would have hated the left wing as well. So, over 100 Spartacists were killed and 13 Freikorps were also killed. The Freikorps were a right wing and wanted a dictatorship back, but they still helped the democratic government. They only helped the democratic government put down left wing uprisings. There were 4 reasons why the Spartacists failed. Firstly, it was poorly organised. They only took over 2 buildings and they didn't really have a plan if they were going to be successful. It would have been impossible to rule Germany. It's a bit like saying you're going to take over a country with no plan. You take over it and you're like, right, what do I do now? Secondly, they didn't really have any support from any left-wing parties. They were on their own. So they were like this rebellious left-wing party who were on their own. Thirdly, Ebert, the president, used the Freikorps. Without the Freikorps, then who knows what could have happened. The aggressive soldiers were enough to crush an unorganised rebellion against the government and stop the left-wing party coming to power. And finally, the uprising fell because their leaders were brutally murdered. And without the leaders, you're not going to have an uprising. That's the Spartacist uprising. So remember, you need to write down the date and whether it was left wing or right wing. Why were they unhappy with the Weimar? Just put a few bullet points. What actually happened? A few bullet points. And what were the consequences? What happened to the leaders? What happened to the whole uprising? Was it a success? Was it a failure? Why? Go back through that information, pause the video here and spend about 5 minutes filling in the information about the Spartacist uprising. The next group were a lot more threatening. The next group were a group called the Kapp Putsch. Now this happened in March 1920. So let's just go back again. Remember that by 1920, the Treaty of Versailles had been signed. So Wolfgang Kapp was a right-wing journalist who opposed all that he believed Friedrich Ebert stood for. Okay, this man really didn't like Ebert, and he didn't like the fact that Germany had been humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the right-wing politicians hated the Weimar because they accepted the treaty. The reason they hated them is because they made Germany incredibly weak. The right-wing individuals especially disliked 2 things. 1, the fact that Germany had to accept all blame for the war, and 2, the army being reduced to 100,000 men, which meant that the army and the Freikorps would be reduced significantly in number. So the Kapp Putsch was a threat. It was assisted by a man called General Lutwitz, who led a group of Freikorps men. Now this is important here. the Freikorps were actually involved in this. So who is going to put this down? On March 13th, 1920, Luttwitz seized Berlin and proclaimed that a new right nationalist government was being established, with Kapp as the chancellor. And Ebert, the president, didn't know what to do. Okay, so him and the government actually left Berlin, which showed how weak he was. The government reconvened in Dresden, and the only thing Ebert could do was ask the people of Berlin to go on a general strike to stop the movement. So anyone that supported Kapp and Luttwitz, Ebert basically said, look, go on strike, stop them. That's really important. That we'll go back to that in a minute. Now, Kapp received support from one of Germany's most respected officers, a man called General Erich Ludendorff, who you're going to look at later on. But the main officers of the German army failed to follow Ludendorff's lead. And it's possible that some of the members of the army actually felt sympathy and support for Ebert because they'd been given so much freedom in dealing with the left wing. Ebert couldn't ask the Freikorps to put this down because the Freikorps were actually taking part in this. And the Freikorps said, basically, those that weren't taking part, troops do not fire on troops. But the military did nothing to stop the putsch and gave no support to Ebert. Now, the general strike that we mentioned earlier that was called for by Ebert basically paralysed the movement. And this was the only reason why the Kapp Putsch failed, one of the main reasons why the Kapp Putsch failed. Okay, and by the 17th of March, Luttwitz and Kapp had fled Berlin. Key difference there is both Kapp and Luttwitz did not get punished for this. Okay, so why did it fail? Number one, lack of leadership. They had Luttwitz, they had Kapp, they had Ludendorff, but other army leaders did not follow this. They only centred on Berlin and didn't spread to the rest of Germany when they could. The government was able to continue. The fact they were able to relocate to Dresden meant that they could continue controlling Germany and asking the people to go on strike. And the fourth reason is the general strike. Now, a lot of people say, why did the people of Berlin go on strike if they hated the government? Well, at this time, the people of Berlin were sick of revolution. So they just accepted it and supported the government. But the key thing here is that the 5 days that the Kapp Putsch was going on showed weakness of the Weimar because it showed that the government couldn't enforce its authority. It showed that the government didn't have much power. It was only the people of Berlin that helped put this down. It's really important that we understand that, okay? But the fact that the government didn't punish anyone involved also shows they were slightly fearful of the right wing. The last bullet point says, the strength of the failed putsch does indicate that the people of Berlin were willing to support Ebert's government. In this sense, it can be argued that Ebert had the support of Berliners, so people who lived in Berlin. Counter-argument to this is that Ebert was irrelevant and that people of Berlin just didn't want any more trouble after the Spartacist and Communist rebellion in 1919. Peace was more important than politics. Now, those people who fought for Kapp and Luttwitz were future supporters of the Nazi Party. All right, and ironically, the Erhardt Brigade, one of Luttwitz's main fighting force, put a sign on their helmets to identify who they were, and this sign was the swastika, which we'll talk about later on. So again, the Kapp Putsch is it's a bit more difficult to understand. Go back to the table, the date, the left, right wing, why were they unhappy, what actually happened, and what were the consequences of the Kapp Putsch. Spend about 5 minutes on this, and then I'll show you the answers for both of the uprisings. So here we go. I've tried to keep it as diluted as possible. So Spartacist uprising, it was left wing. It was in 1919. They were unhappy because they believed that workers should be in control of the society, not a government. What happened? It focused on Berlin. Its leaders were Luxemburg and Liebknecht. On the 5th of January, they marched on Berlin. The uprising was over by the 15th as the government used the Freikorps to destroy it, and 100 Spartacists were killed. The Weimar looked weak as they used force to put it down, and the Freikorps were used to put down rebellions by the left. Another consequence you could have there is that the leaders were brutally murdered. The Kapp Putsch, right wing, in 1920, they were mainly angry at the fact that the army was reduced to 100,000 men, and also the fact that Germany accepted all blame for the war. Kapp and Luttwitz seized Berlin on March the 13th. The government had to leave Berlin and ran away to Dresden. They called a general strike. The people listened, but the Freikorps didn't help this time. They said, "Troops do not fire on troops." Consequences showed that the Weimar did have some support, but one of the key things that made them look very weak was that nobody was punished. Now, one thing we need to remember is that the violence didn't stop there. This weren't the only two things that were happening in this period. So I want you to finish off the sentence in your book. In the years 1919 to 22, the government faced more threats, as well as Spartacist and Kapp. For example, I'm going to read the information. It says, even after the Spartacist and Kapp uprisings, there were lots of challenges. One challenge included the assassination of members of the government, including Hugo Hasse, Matthias Erzberger, and Walter Rathenau. In all, between 1919 and 1922, there were 376 political murders, mostly of left-wing or moderate politicians. Nobody was punished for the murders. Judges felt sorry for the right wing, so they got away with a lot. And on top of this, the political parties had their own armed groups to protect them. So these extreme armed groups, even the middle actually, had their own groups to protect them. So the communists had a group called the Red Front Fighters. The DNVP was supported by a group called the Steel Helmets.
Here's the top Wikipedia result.
And the middle parties had their own groups, such as the Black, Red, Gold Flag Group. So the Social Democrats, the SPD, had that. So if you finish off that sentence, try and think of three things that the government also faced on top of the Spartacist and the Kapp. So to finish the lesson today, here is a good way of remembering the Spartacist and the Kapp. So if you add either S or K, so for example, right wing, you know that's going to be the Kapp Putsch. Freikorps, that can actually be the Kapp and the Spartacist. 1920, that's the Kapp. Ended by a workers' strike, that's the Kapp. So go through, it's a really good way, a really good revision tool to help you remember. And once you've done this, this will be your first lesson on the challenges, ready for the next lesson on hyperinflation due to the occupation of the Ruhr.